Okay, I had a buddy ask me to explain a bit more about a supergun. Most people know that a supergun is a way to play an arcade board at home, but most people don't really understand how simple they are. I've seen videos where people talk about a harness or, various models, but that's not the point of this video. This video is going to attempt to explain just what a supergun actually is. And in all, people will tell you, oh, it's a cabinet in a box, which it is. But people don't really seem to understand what that means. Truth is, a supergun is the simplest device you could possibly think of. It is nothing more than a mess of wires. That's it. Just a bunch of wires that connect stuff. Okay. So, if you look at an arcade board, what is an arcade board? Basically, it's a video game console that's designed to play one game, just one. That's it. Like if you think of a more contemporary video game console, it's got processor, graphics processor, RAM, sound. It's got all the materials needed to play the game, but it lacks the game. Arcade PCB, the game is here too. There's chips for the programs, for the sound, the graphics, the processor. It's all here. It doesn't need anything else. It's all here. All you have to do to use it on one of these is to hook up the connections. Okay. So if you look at, pull out some random arcade boards here, and notice that they all have one of these, 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 one of these. They all have a bunch of pins on them. These pins are how you connect everything to the board. So what do we have to connect? Well, let's think about it. This is our game. It does everything. But what does it need? Well, it needs controls. 2, it needs video, it needs sound, and it needs power so it can turn on. You can connect these 4 things. You can play this on this. No problem. So, how do we do that? A mess of wires. See, okay. You won't be able to see this probably. It'll probably be too blurry, but my little PCB here that I have connecting is fully labeled. You've got ground, plus 5 volts, minus 5 volts, 12 volts, red, blue, green, player 1 up, player 1 down. And this is just, basically labeling these wires. So, for example, let's start with controls. An arcade stick is a very simple device. It has 4 micro switches, up, down, left, right. That's it. So in order for the up switch to work, it just needs a wire that connects the up micro switch all the way to the up pin on the board. And then you have one for left, which goes all the way up, etc. And the buttons are the same. This button has a wire. The wire goes through and connects to the pin. If you have all the wires from your controls connecting to your pins, your controls are fine. It'll work, no problem. Now, there's the old school way to connect would be to just solder your control wires onto your control pins. But that would be a pain in the ass and a pain to change, right? Every time you want to change a game, you have to solder and unsolder. Oh, hell no. Which is why we now have the JAMA harness. The JAMA harness is just a bunch of wires that connect to an edge connector, so you can easily plug it in and unplug it. Your boards. That's it. Alright, so we've got our controls. Okay, what's next? How about power? Truth be told, 2/3 of this box is the power supply. If the power supply was external, this box could be minuscule. So, for power supply, you have a few options. I prefer to use an actual arcade power supply, which is what is in here. A lot of people will also use an ATX computer power supply. All you really need is something that outputs 5 volts which is what the board runs on typically, because if it's a JAMA board, it'll run on 5 volts, and 12 volts, which is generally used for the sound hardware. Now, some old games, the sound hardware runs off the negative 5 volts. So, because of that, I have negative 5 volts wired on my arcade power supply. Most arcade power supplies will supply negative 5 volts, but a lot of computer ones won't. So that is something to think about. But again, it's really only for very few, very selected games. A lot of data E-stack games, actually. Okay, so, and I do recommend making sure that the 5 volt line is adjustable, because some boards are very picky on how much current they require. Not volts. This is often a misunderstanding. It's not changing the volts. It's meant to these boards are meant to have 5 volts. It's the amount of current that they need, which affects how well they run. Something like, for example, a Neo Geo MVS 6 slot requires a massive amount of current. So you want to be able to adjust that. The majority of power supplies out there, you can adjust the 5 volts easily. Now, on a computer power supply, you usually can adjust it, but it's usually hidden because typically you set it once and you never touch it again. But in arcade boards, since they can be picky, it's nice to have the arcade power supply because there's simply a little screw that you turn and you can adjust the 5 volts. Easy, easy. That's our power. Okay, so what's left? Sound and video. Sound, really simple. The majority of these games are mono only anyway. So that means you just have one speaker. You connect to that speaker by having, well, speaker plus, speaker minus, and ground. You just connect those wires, boom, you got sound. So what's left? Video. Here's where things get tricky. These boards output in RGB. That is red, green, blue. Pure red, green, blue. The simplest, purest form of colors that you can get in electronics. Specifically, it's 15 kilohertz, low resolution RGB. Problem, the majority of TVs cannot take, well, let me rephrase that. NTSC TVs, such as the United States, Canada, Japan, will not take an RGB signal. They are not compatible with them. However, if you're in Europe, the majority of European TVs will actually accept RGB. Meaning, if you have an RGB capable TV, you just have to connect the red, the blue, the green, the sync, the 5 volts, and the ground wires to the TV. Boom, you're done. You're finished. But if you do not have RGB capable TV, you need to convert that signal. The simplest way to do that is to get something like an RGB transcoder, which will transcode the RGB signal into a component signal. Most people know what component video is. However, the truth is, component video is compressed RGB. Now, the theory behind it is that the colors you lose by compression are supposed to be invisible to the human eye. In theory. Truth be told, this isn't truly true because, well, my TV can actually take RGB. However, it's only through a very annoying Sony proprietary connector. But with the PS2, I can switch between RGB and component on the fly, and you can see the difference. But anyway, yeah. So component is just compressed RGB, and there's probably one of the best ways to connect for most people. I actually have a few ways of doing that. For example, here in my ugly box is a J-Rock video encoder, which just compresses the RGB and spits out component, which then I have hooked up. This is an actual encoder. You could also just get a direct transcoder, which doesn't change the resolution or anything. It's just pure RGB in, component out. You could also use like an XRGB, which will then take the RGB and spit out VGA signal, which you can then use on a monitor or almost anything. The video encoder is easily the most expensive part of the Supergun. Like, a J-Rock is around $80, I think, for the component board that's all complete. But that's where the most of the money goes. Once you get that, boom, you're done, you're set. You've got your video working, and you can play any JAMA game. You know, then if you need to change stuff around, you can get a conversion harness, But it's really, once again, just a mess of wires. Later PCB stuff, they started using game cartridges like, I got F3 cards here, or CPS2 stuff here. But this is all getting later. You just need wires that connect the power, the video, the sound, and the controls. If you can do that, you can play just about any game. Well, I hope that's a bit more clear, and see you next time.